plants die. And so we do need a certain level. And so the question now is 400 parts per million too high? And I don't know that it is. Some of this, we know that there are a lot of benefits. So it doesn't cause global warming, and we don't know that it's too high. Now, another thing about CO2, first of all, it's undisputed that the burning of fossil fuels does cause CO2 emissions, okay? But what percent of the total CO2 in our atmosphere is caused by the burning of fossil fuels? And this is where some of the scientists dispute it. And some of the scientists believe that it's about 5%, and that therefore what we do with that 5%, even if there's a lot of CO2 emitted by fossil fuels, that would have basically almost a negligible effect on the total world CO2. So again, I'm not the scientist on this, but some scientists have found that. And so that's a very significant finding. Now, there's something else too. There's believed that the presence of water vapors has a multiplier effect on the CO2 in the atmosphere. And while I'm not an expert in this, some recent studies have discounted this multiplier effect, so that some people say, well, you're up to 400 parts per million, but that's like having 1,200 parts per million. And recent studies have challenged that and say that no, they don't think there may be a slight multiplier effect, but it's not that significant. So if the human CO2 emissions from fossil fuels and breathing and so forth, if that's only a small percentage, where does the rest of the CO2 come from? Do you know?
I don't know the answer, but I think there were some studies that showed the ocean or different areas might have been been a cause of a lot of this.
That's very good. So according to Plimmer, a 2009 study, he says there are more than 10,000 earthquakes each year, which outgas CO2 in the atmosphere. He said that this source is not considered by the IPCC models. And of course, water covers 70% of the earth, and most of the volcanoes, one of them said that about 85% of the volcanic and earthquake eruptions come from volcanoes under the water. And so those emissions, they eventually rise to the surface through the water, but they have been accounting for them was not included in the IPCC studies. This is a significant emission. So
it's telling that they don't want to have a debate on these things. They just want to believe their conclusion, because I think they probably realize they're not going to, necessarily win the argument if they base it on science, on a broad, on all the facts that are involved in making that conclusion.
So the ultimate question on CO2 increases is are we having too much CO2? And that is certainly disputed. A number of reputable scientists say, no, we're not having too much. And that some have say that 400 parts per million is a tipping point. Some of the scientists dispute that. So again, in a radio broadcast, it's hard to give references, but I would refer you to my book. It's 116 pages and has a lot of sources for virtually every finding that I've mentioned. It's not a long book, but it would be very helpful for someone who's trying to get into this initially.
And Paul, you'd think if this certainly isn't a defining study on this, but if greenhouses use 1,200 parts per million and 400 is a tipping point, according to some folks, how would anybody survive going into a greenhouse? And certainly people have to go into greenhouses. So that would seem to dispel that some.
What I read about CO2 causing global warming, I want to just mention briefly. Some think there's a very wide consensus that it does cause global warming. Some dispute it and say that actually it follows global warming when it does occur. But that this increase in CO2 causing catastrophic climate problems, that is seriously disputed by many scientists. In I think it was forget the year. I think it was 2006. I may be wrong on the year. There was a report by the one of the congressional hearings on climate change, and there was a minority report. It's interesting. The divide at that time was pretty close to 50-50. There were slightly more people that went with the majority report, believing that humans were causing climate change, but a significant minority, close to 50%, disputed that. Thousands of scientists disputed that. Nevertheless, the climate change lobby seemed to run with this and treat it like a 100% mandate. Actually, they'll say a 97% mandate, which also is not true. We'll talk about that next in another time. So just see if I have a couple other thoughts. Well, no, that's about it. Did you have anything else to say on CO₂?
No, just another example of, taking information and manipulating it and failing to consider any information that it runs counter to the conclusions they want to make.
So just in conclusion, I would also say that CO₂ emissions are causing irreversible and catastrophic climate change has not been established. Neither has the human role in the production of CO₂ been established as causing this. It's time for a debate on this. And when President Biden and others say that the science is settled, they're not right. They're wrong. And before we pass devastating economic measures that will prevent people from having the benefits from inexpensive fuel and do these things that will hurt the economy, we ought to make sure we get it right. That's all we have for today. Thank you for joining us. Remember, the liberties we enjoy in America can be maintained only when its citizens are moral and informed participants in the democratic processes. Closing argument can help us to do this. We'll see you next time. This is Paul Smith.